The recent uprising in the Middle East has definitely huge implications for the U.S. policy and policymakers, how they think about the region, how they plan for the region, how they want to engage with the region. One thing that, or a couple of things actually, that we are learning from what is happening, that U.S. policy should not be just aligned with individuals, leaders in their individual capacity, but actually responsive more to the voices of the public, the people, and also to rethink of them as citizens of these systems and not as subjects. I think that's a major shift in the type of thinking that they should have. Another thing, naturally, with the current events in North Africa, in particular Libya, as it's unfolding day by day, is our arms agreements with the region and how they will be used. Initially, all were thought of as defensive, but unfortunately now we are seeing that they are used as tools against the people of the region, and I think this has huge implications. And also in terms of the types of interventions that we are thinking of, and the U.S. image, we heard Secretary of State Clinton speak about this, and policy implications in terms of the application in the region, how they're being understood, how they respond to the sentiments of the people there, how they're being heard, how they impact, I think more importantly, U.S. Citizens of descent from the region, the diaspora community, and what role they can play. And so we need to align them to be actually responsive to our own citizens and the citizens of the region. So we cannot see them as quite not linked, but actually include more of them in the policy shaping, the policy making, and also their cultural understanding and fluency of the aspects of issues that are happening there is quite important. I think there is also implications in terms of the types of engagements with how they are being listened to over there. Our understanding is there has been a high-level delegation who has gone to Egypt in particular, and they did not want any American intervention or meddling. And that tells us that some of the design of our policies has not been well received. They may fit our own worldview, but do not actually respond to the worldview in the region. And finally, on the rhetoric of terrorism and security, how we have held these in such high, they trumped every decision that we have. We saw, or as far as we know now, that Al-Qaeda it was not the motivator behind any of this. It was irrelevant. But we have to make sure that any policies, any actually actions that are taken on Capitol Hill, whether in Congress or in the Senate, do not translate in the region as actually being anti-Islamist, anti-Muslim, an Islamic worldview that actually could have opportunities for us rather than be a hindrance in the resolution. And so different types of partnerships would be quite important. A major point that has to be addressed and articulated with authenticity and open the debate in a healthy way is the question of the peace process and Israel and how it factors out. I think some of the questions we need to consider: A, what does it mean for the current Israeli leadership and how they should rethink their engagement in the region? Secondly, from a U.S. policy, how do we re-engage with Israel to better understand how our interests should be aligned with the region in general, with our global partners to address these types of issues. We also saw, and we need to rethink, what does it mean actually for the people in the region? And if we are just going to be aligned with the individuals who are managing the peace process, not on behalf of the people, but on behalf of external interest, what are the implications for their sustainability, for their success? And so the peace process cannot be just a token process to kind of represent continuity, actually, and support a stalemate. It also begs the question, what do we do about asymmetrical conflicts, and what do we do with this, and whether these types of processes that we have been promoting and supporting, what are their implications for asymmetrical conflicts? So if we take the negotiators constantly out of their own representation in their community, that has huge impact on the re-entry. Another thing is the type of emissaries and the kind of emissaries that we are sending to the region representing the U.S. in relation to the Arab-Israeli conflict. We again need to be very sensitive on how they are articulating our agendas, what kind of approach they are thinking, what are the implications, and more importantly, how to evaluate the success or lack of success of the different designs that they are bringing with them. We know from our practice in the field of conflict analysis and resolution that the qualities and the characteristics of the intervener play very heavily in the perceptions of the parties. And one thing that has not been articulated enough is what role does the U.S. want to play. If it's a convener, as we have seen it on many, many levels, articulate its role as a neutral third party, unbiased third party playing in the region, then our actions have to align with this. The recent veto from the U.S. in the UN around the settlement issue, I think, played into many of the desperation in the region around the role of the U.S. and continued alienation. Also, perhaps, if we were to talk to the Israeli public in light of all the current events that are happening in the region, what do they want from their governments, and how should their governments adjust to the current changes that, and how will they respond to them? Not only to play the security card, which we have known most of the responses have been played through power, but actually what does that mean to be a good neighbor in the region, and how should their neighbors perceive them as, or understand them as, good neighbors in the region? And so really I think the same way that the people in the Arab world are bringing their voice forward, the people in Israel should reshift how they're asking their leadership to represent them at the negotiating table. If I may just share an observation, we also see that this leadership has been there for equally a long time and partnering with Arab leaders who have been there equally for a very long time. And so we have not seen necessarily new blood, new changes, new visions for these types of relationships. And for the U.S., I think that has huge implications. Another important issue we have to pay attention to with regard to the current events in North Africa and the Arab world is the role of the Islamists, and actually the gap between our narrative in the U.S. and the interpretation of what's happening in the ground. The narrative in the U.S. has continuously framed any movements in the Arab world as being Islamist-led, that they, by this, they would breed a leadership that we cannot work with, etc., etc. And actually the Uprising showed us that what the people are asking for was more to deal with humiliation, lack of representation, lack of even the most basic needs of the people being met. And so we saw this gap translate between what we have been identifying as the problem and what the real problem on the ground. And that actually took away from our leadership position in the region because, again, we aligned ourselves with the wrong narrative rather than aligning or listening, I would say, to what is really happening on the ground. Another thing we may want to reflect on is how have we dealt within our own communities with groups that have been not in the middle, or should we say, or does not represent of the majority of the people. We have found ways within our systems to incorporate them. Europe has found a way to incorporate them. By the Christian Democrats, for example, or Christian parties in parliaments. And so what you do is you bring them in the system in a healthy way where the discourse becomes through the overarching goal of looking after the system reflects what the people want and the system wants, and the debate can be run in a healthy way. We also, the timing of this interview happens after the hearing on Capitol Hill related to Islam by Congressman King, and how that might translate overseas as some media coverage definitely will take place to the average person, and how that also puts us, though the hearing is, we respect the opportunity for debate on the Hill on sensitive issues, we also need to think and reflect strategically on how, who is representing those voices, what kind of testimonies are taking place, how does this translate internationally in the hands of third parties that want to continue to demonize the U.S. and its role. And so I think our public officials, though we encourage the debate and definitely should not take it away, we have to rethink how the framing is impactful, not only on Muslim communities in the U.S. and their neighbors who have to live together for centuries to come in this country. So the internal impact and how it translates externally for the people in the region. And then finally, the issue of the problem solving that may go with any group that there is some representation that does not align with its values. This group itself has to be strengthened, actually not taken away. You don't want it to become defensive. With the Muslim communities internationally and here, we have to encourage that worldview within the religion that supports, again, a discourse that says, well, look, in the U.S. we are respectful of different minorities and groups and their freedom for religion and religious tolerance, rather than give the message that we are supporting religious intolerance in our country, which is actually one of the most fundamental principles of how the Republic was formed.